Among all the names that evoke the horror of the 20th century, Auschwitz occupies a central place. It was not merely a concentration camp. It was the heart of a machine designed to strip human beings of their dignity, their identity, and ultimately their lives. For years, men, women, and children arrived in sealed railway cars, unaware that their final destination was extermination. More than 1 million people died there, many without leaving any trace, others with only a tattooed number as the sole testimony to their existence. But behind every number there were decisions. There were hands, there were faces, and there was a cold, bureaucratic logic that turned murder into routine. Here is a journey through the darkest side of Auschwitz, a story that cannot be softened, that must not be forgotten, and that even today overwhelms with the scale of the suffering and the depth of the cruelty. The beginning of hell. On April 30th, 1940, Rudolf Haas fulfilled a long-standing ambition. At the age of 39, and after 6 years of service in the SS, he was appointed commandant of one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis in the New Reich. On that spring day, he arrived to take up his duties in a small town located in what, 18 months earlier, had been the southwest of Poland before becoming part of Upper Silesia. Its Polish name was Auschwitz, and in German Auschwitz. Despite the promotion, the concentration camp that Haas was to run did not yet exist. In fact, his first task was to oversee its construction from a series of dilapidated, insect-infested barracks that had belonged to the Polish army. The appearance of the surroundings could hardly have been more depressing. This land situated between the Sola and Vistula rivers was monotonous and had a damp, unhealthy climate. On that first day, no one could have predicted that within 5 years this camp would become the scene of the greatest massacre the world has ever known. The story of the chain of decisions that led to this transformation is one of the most terrible in human history, and it allows us to understand in an exceptional way how the Nazi state functioned. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and other Nazi leaders made decisions that led to the extermination of more than 1 million people at Auschwitz. Nevertheless, the mindset of lower-ranking officials like Haas also contributed decisively to this crime. Without the leadership talents that he demonstrated in the field, until then unknown, of mass murder on such a colossal scale, Auschwitz would never have functioned as it did. In reality, there was almost nothing exceptional about Rudolf Haas. He was a man of average height, with regular features and dark hair. Several Polish prisoners of Auschwitz confirm this impression and remember him as a calm and moderate individual, identical to the countless people we pass every day in the street without even noticing their presence. His appearance could therefore not have been further from the conventional stereotype of the flushed-faced SS monster, which makes him all the more terrifying. His character and beliefs had been shaped by his reaction to the events of the previous 25 years of German history, the most turbulent period the country had ever known. The Auschwitz concentration camp is synonymous with the absolute evil that Nazism taught. Jews and Roma served as guinea pigs for the Nazis' diabolical experiments, which gassed more than 1 million people and killed others through starvation, cold, exhaustion, or simply through loneliness and despair. Yet many prisoners resisted total dehumanization in the camp by striving to preserve their dignity. Taking care of personal hygiene, writing, or drawing were acts that helped them survive. The events are recounted through the voices of those who survived the hell of Auschwitz. The unbearable silence after the murders of children, the barbarity of medical experiments on thousands of men and women, or the struggle to survive in a camp of horror and death. Auschwitz, epicenter of the death industry. Auschwitz is today regarded as the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust and Hitler's genocidal policy, especially from 1942 onward, when it became the epicenter of Nazi crimes, a unique place that combined the largest deportation camp in the entire Nazi concentration camp universe with the largest extermination center in the history of the Third Reich. For all these reasons, Auschwitz has become synonymous with absolute evil. As mentioned earlier, it was there that the first experiment in mass murder in a gas chamber took place in September 1941, using Soviet prisoners of war. It was also there that Jews and Roma served as guinea pigs for the diabolical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors and nurses. More than 1 million human beings from 15 European countries were gassed, and more than 200,000 men, women, and children died of hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion, brutality, or simply absolute loneliness and despair. Yet Auschwitz did not begin as a concentration camp, still less as an extermination camp. Located on the outskirts of the town of Auschwitz, the Polish name for Auschwitz, the camp had been built in the 19th century to house immigrants from the province of Galicia, then one of the poorest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who were trying to reach Berlin or Vienna. At that time, it consisted of brick dormitories for 3,000 workers and 90 wooden barracks that could accommodate more than 9,000 workers, as well as other buildings such as a chapel, a theater, and a hospital. The camp's population quickly exceeded that of Auschwitz, which had around 14,000 inhabitants, half of whom were Jewish. And the railway station, a fact that would later prove of great importance, was little more than a kilometer away and connected the town, via Krakow, to the railway corridor running all the way to Hamburg via Breslau and Berlin. At the end of the First World War, with the redrawing of borders, Auschwitz was incorporated into Poland, and what had previously been an immigrant center became a military barracks where, until 1938, the base of the Polish 21st Cavalry Regiment was stationed. The invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1st, 1939, followed by that of the Soviet Union on the 17th of the same month as planned in the pact signed between the USSR and Germany by Molotov and von Ribbentrop, would change not only its fate but also that of what would later become the Auschwitz camp. Indeed, thanks to their respective foreign ministers who gave their name to the pact, the USSR and Germany had signed on August 23, 1939 a non-aggression pact that allowed Germany to attack Poland on September 1, 1939, without fear of Soviet intervention. The pact included a secret clause providing for the division of Poland and Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. In accordance with this plan, the Soviet army occupied and annexed eastern Poland in the autumn of 1939. The Nazis felt profound contempt for the Poles. In a document sent to Hitler in May 1940, Himmler stated that their destiny was to be a nation of uneducated slaves. The non-German population of the Eastern Territories must not receive education beyond primary school. The sole purpose of primary school would be to teach elementary arithmetic, counting up to 500 at most, writing their name, and learning that it is God's will to obey the Germans, to be honest, hard-working, and well-behaved. I consider it unnecessary for them to learn to read. In this document, which reflects with sinister clarity Nazi racial ideology, Himmler went further. Thus, Polish children aged 6 to 10 whose blood was considered racially acceptable were torn from their families and sent to Germany to be educated far from their biological parents. The personal and family tragedy of these children did not concern Himmler. It fitted perfectly into Nazi doctrine, which classified and hierarchized human beings according to race and blood. German repression was first exercised against Polish cultural and religious elites. Men and women were shot, others taken prisoner, and sent to concentration camps in the Reich. However, the prisons of Upper Silesia quickly became saturated, and in December 1939, the Nazi police services considered creating in this area a quarantine camp for Polish prisoners before their transfer to Germany. The choice fell on Auschwitz, that is, Auschwitz, 60 kilometers west of Krakow, in a part of Poland annexed to Germany, whose facilities were under the German army. Rudolf Haas, then administrator of Sachsenhausen camp, was tasked with checking its viability and considered the old facilities adequate provided some modifications were made. Himmler approved his report and decided to create a concentration camp on the site, abandoning the initial idea of a temporary quarantine camp. Appointed commandant of the new camp, Haas arrived at Auschwitz on May 1, 1940, accompanied by a few SS members. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The task with which I was charged was not easy. It involved transforming in the shortest possible time a camp whose buildings were well constructed but in a state of total disrepair and infested with insects into a complex capable of accommodating or passing through 10,000 prisoners. Scarcely had we arrived when the Breslau authorities already wanted to know when I could receive the first prisoner transfers. From his arrival at Auschwitz in May 1940, Rudolf Haas would create a huge construction site to adapt the old facilities to the new requirements. Brick buildings were joined by others. Stories were raised, and the same infrastructure as in the other concentration camps was built. The political command office of the Gestapo, kitchens, showers, a hospital, a prison, a gallows, and a crematorium. Barbed wire electrified fences were erected, paths and streets were opened. Auschwitz became a vast, fortified city. The first prisoners to arrive at Auschwitz, on May 20th, were 30 Germans imprisoned for common law offenses, destined to serve as capos transferred from Sachsenhausen camp, where they had been specially trained for this purpose, and whose task was to implement the brutal methods in force in German concentration camps since 1933. They were given registration numbers from 1 to 30. As German Reich prisoners holding leadership positions, they were feared by the other detainees. This group of criminals and their assistants occupied a privileged place in the prisoner integration system and enjoyed the protection of the SS. As camp employees, they were exempt from manual labor and had the power of life and death over the detainees. They were better fed, wore leather boots and tailor-made clothes, in addition to other privileges. Vasek was one of them. A former criminal, he was a cruel tyrant. He forced prisoners into sports sessions, during which they had to jump, crawl, and lie down under a continuous rain of baton blows. When, exhausted and bloodied, they could no longer get up, Vasek beat them to death. The deaf, the paralyzed, the blind, or the wounded suffered the same fate. Recalcitrants were subjected to special treatment before death. Suspension of the body by the hands tied behind the back, starvation in a dark cell. At the beginning of June 1940, 120 SS men arrived from the Krakow military garrison and from the Buchenwald, Dachau, and Flossenburg camps. Then, on the 14th of the same month, the day the Wehrmacht entered Paris, the first real prisoners arrived. 728 Poles, students and soldiers, including a few Jews. In general, these detainees were suspected of belonging to the Polish resistance. Their first task was to build the camp. However, they were not enough. At Haas's request, the German mayor of the town of Auschwitz forced the local Jewish community to provide 300 workers. Once the labor problem was solved, there remained that of the materials needed for construction. Haas had overcome the first obstacle, but he lacked materials. The solution he found could not have been simpler or more suited to the camp's ethic. Prisoners were forced to demolish houses that had previously belonged to Poles in order to appropriate bricks, wood, and other materials. Stealing or organizing, in camp jargon, thus became a norm of behavior. It was Haas himself who acknowledged that he was obliged to resolve the situation quickly, obtaining by lawful or unlawful means the petrol needed to go into town to fetch, by the same means, pots and pans for the kitchens. As for the indispensable barbed wire, he had no choice but to steal the required quantity urgently. The prisoner's work was very hard and violent, and in July of that same year, the first crematorium was built by the German company Toff and Son of Erfurt, intended to burn the bodies of the first victims. This crematorium began operating on August 15, 1940. In the Auschwitz camp, later called Auschwitz I, were located the central political command and the luxurious residence of Commandant Haas, as well as the detainees' barracks and several maintenance and supply facilities. It was protected by a double 5-meter-high barbed wire fence, carrying high-voltage current and brightly lit at night by a line of floodlights. Every 20 or 30 meters the fence was interrupted by watchtowers equipped with powerful searchlights that illuminated the entire camp, and at the top of which stood an SS man with a tripod-mounted machine gun. A 3-meter-wide strip of gravel-covered ground separated the double fence along its entire length. Anyone caught trying to breach the fence was immediately shot. On March 1, 1941, Himmler visited the camp for the first time and ordered its expansion. The aim was to accommodate an additional 30,000 prisoners at Auschwitz itself and 100,000 in a new camp to be built, which would be Birkenau, also later called Auschwitz II, initially intended to house prisoners of war. This decision also had economic aims: to allow the largest German chemical group, IG Farben, to set up a factory nearby whose construction would be carried out by 10,000 detainees. The Birkenau construction project then began 3 kilometers from the main camp, starting with the expulsion of the inhabitants of the surrounding villages. Today, a memorial at the camp entrance recalls that in 1940 and 1941, the inhabitants of these villages were expelled by the German occupier, and that Birkenau was built on the site of the demolished buildings. Moreover, the camp owes its name to one of these villages, the hamlet of Berzezinka, or Birkenau in German, located in a birch forest, innocent trees that gave their pretty name to the most abominable place. Birkenau, initially planned for Soviet prisoners of war, began to be built in earnest on October 8, 1941. However, the Russian prisoners numbered scarcely 10,000, and their role was to build the camp. Starved, exhausted, and mistreated, they died by the hundreds. Birkenau's architecture was designed from the outset for overcrowding and lack of privacy. The barracks, mostly wooden, contained 62 three-tier bunks, in each of which 4 to 6 prisoners were forced to share the same bed. There was no privacy, no space to keep the slightest personal belonging. The latrines were outside the barracks and consisted of an endless succession of holes almost touching one another, opening onto an evacuation channel. Birkenau is a faithful reflection of the Nazi policy of humiliation and dehumanization of prisoners. Ultimately, Birkenau would cover an area of 170 hectares surrounded by 16 kilometers of barbed wire. It would contain 300 barracks, including accommodation, latrines, kitchens, and warehouses. Until 1945, Birkenau housed the vast majority of the detainees of the Auschwitz complex, Jews, Poles, Germans, Roma, in infamous and inhuman living conditions. In addition to the overcrowding and promiscuity in the barracks where detainees were crammed together, the water available was insufficient for hygiene. Feet constantly waded through mud for lack of passable paths. On rainy days, there was no alternative. They had to lie down in soaked clothes. Birkenau also contained various facilities designed for the extermination of Jews. At once a concentration camp and an immediate extermination center, Auschwitz and Birkenau would be the principal achievement of the final solution, especially from 1942 onward, after the Wannsee Conference. The SS at Auschwitz, the men and the machine. One of the greatest perversions of the Nazi concentration camp system was the forced use of the victims as their own executioners. Thus, in the camps devoted exclusively to extermination, a handful of SS men sufficed to achieve the objective. It was the prisoners themselves who were obliged to ensure the functioning of the death machine. Auschwitz, however, was a complex of several camps with a dual function. That is why, over the course of its history, the number of SS guards increased. According to the archives of the Auschwitz Museum, estimates indicate around 700 SS guards in 1941, rising to 4,480 men and 71 women by mid-January 1945 due to the needs of the final evacuation of the camp. But the total number of people who served at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945 was far higher, between 8,000 and 8,200 male guards and 200 women. According to the same source, the vast majority of guards had little education, only primary schooling. Only 5.5% had university studies, mostly doctors or architects working in the construction department of the various facilities. They were predominantly Roman Catholic. Next came Lutherans, then atheists. Among SS members belonging to the Nazi Party, Lutherans formed the largest group. A large proportion of the SS guards were of German nationality, Reichsdeutsch, or otherwise Volksdeutsch. The number of the latter increased progressively, leading them to complain that thousands of guards barely spoke German. Female guards did not begin working at Auschwitz until 1942, with the creation of the women's camp, and also because of the increased recruitment of men for the front. Although they did not belong to the SS, an exclusively male organization, the candidates signed a contract with the camp administration unit and were counted as SS members, subject to the same disciplinary rules. Haas wrote, that despite very active propaganda by the National Socialist women's organizations, very few women volunteered to serve in a concentration camp. Those who presented themselves voluntarily or under constraint received training for a few weeks at Ravensbrück. After that, they were released to work with the detainees. In a description that does not lack a certain misogyny, Haas states that they were generally of extremely low moral level. Despite ruthless sanctions, they systematically stole and used female prisoners as intermediaries. The long years of Nazi indoctrination and the influence of Germanic militaristic culture, combined with the morally degrading atmosphere of the camp, led the SS guards to a progressive dehumanization that conditioned their behavior in an intolerable way, even from the SS' own point of view. Two attitudes characterized this behavior: sadism and corruption. Beyond hunger, cold, exhausting work, lack of hygiene, and the promiscuity inherent in the concentration camp universe designed by Nazism, beyond punishments for breaches of discipline, medical experiments on living human beings, and the gassing of victims, the guards indulged in other kinds of initiatives of their own accord. The consequences of sadism for the prisoners were a matter of indifference to the camp administration. In this sense, two measures were taken: the creation of a brothel which proved powerless to curb their perverse impulses, and, more significantly, the replacement of guards by the prisoners themselves in enforcing discipline, including beatings and other punishments. This latter measure had a profound impact on the detainees, causing them immense anguish. The Auschwitz commandant himself confirmed this. Those who were still capable of reacting felt inexplicable pain at being treated in this way by their own comrades. The brutality and perfidy of the guards had far less effect on them than the cruelty of their fellow sufferers. Nothing crushed them more than the feeling of absolute helplessness in the face of the moral tortures inflicted by the latter. Corruption proved a far more complicated problem for the Nazi administration to solve. The SS sought to project the image of an irreproachable organization. For Himmler, an SS man could not have ideals and at the same time fill his pockets, maintain relations with Jewesses, or drown in alcohol during collective orgies. That is why in 1941 a special SS and police court was created to combat corruption, headed by Judge Conrad Morgan. Morgan succeeded in conducting a few investigations into senior SS officials, especially at Auschwitz, where he went in mid-1943 after the discovery of a personal package from the camp containing 2 kilograms of gold from victims' teeth. Corruption remained inevitable over the years. It grew in a crescendo all the stronger as the end of the war approached and demoralization increased in the face of Germany's impending defeat. It profited not only ordinary guards, but also the highest-ranking SS officers, although in these cases there were generally no criminal consequences. Moreover, the court only prosecuted the most powerful leaders as a last resort. Maximilian Grabner, Gerhard Palach, and Hans Almier, senior SS officials at Auschwitz, were among the leaders investigated by Morgan, but without consequence. Another was the Auschwitz commandant himself, Rudolf Haas, accused of having impregnated a female prisoner. Haas was indeed questioned, but he was too big a fish. The court received threats, and the matter was duly forgotten. On July 31, 1941, Göring tasked Heydrich, head of Reich Security, by letter with beginning all necessary organizational, practical, and financial preparations for a comprehensive solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. And in August of the same year, Hitler declared, "I will not rest until we too have drawn the final consequences with regard to the Jews." Both Göring's letter and Hitler's statement, followed by many others in the same vein, reveal a decisive escalation in Nazi anti-Semitic rhetoric. From the autumn of 1941, Hitler's speeches became increasingly clear and threatening. Indeed, parallel to the growing inability of the German army to defeat the Soviets, rage and hatred against the Jews, the ancient enemies always blamed, this time accused of acting against Germany in Bolshevik uniform, increased. Throughout October, the diatribes followed one another, distilling growing hatred. On the 17th of that month, at a meal, Hitler declared that the prerequisite for any change is the elimination of the Jews, and on the 21st he warned, By exterminating this pest, we will render a service to humanity that the German people cannot yet understand. In December, especially after the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Germany, in Hitler's words, declared war on the United States. Indeed, in the autumn of 1941, some of the main preparatory measures for systematic extermination were decided. The introduction on September 1st of the Yellow Star for all Jews over the age of 6, and on September 18th, the beginning of mass deportations to the east. On December 6th, the gas vans of Chelmno, the first death camp, became operational with a killing capacity of 1,000 people per day. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka would follow as part of the so-called Action Reinhardt. The extermination campaign, begun with the massacres of Jews and Bolsheviks carried out mainly by the Einsatzgruppen, was then systematically organized from the first half of 1942 by means of politico-administrative decisions ranging from the establishment in Germany of a unified command with clearly defined responsibilities, particularly with the Wannsee Conference, to negotiations with the authorities of the occupied countries. The aim was to set up an organized and efficient system of deportation, selection, forced labor, and extermination. On May 18, 1942, an attack took place in Berlin at the site of the anti-Soviet exhibition, the Soviet Paradise. And on the 27th of the same month, Heydrich was the target, as already mentioned, of a bomb attack by the Czech resistance, finally dying on July 4th. In reprisal for this attack, the Germans completely razed the village of Lidice near Prague, where the resistance fighters were supposedly hiding. All the men of the village were murdered, the women deported to concentration camps, and most of the children sent to Chelmno and then gassed. Probably as a result of these two attacks, a meeting between Hitler and Himmler took place on 3, 4, and July 5, 1942, intended to accelerate the extermination program. It was also at this time that the decision was taken to transform Auschwitz into the largest extermination center of the Reich. That summer, Rudolf Haas was summoned by Hitler. In his statement, Haas claims, though uncertainly, that the meeting took place in the summer of 1941, but the majority of historians consider that the Auschwitz commandant was mistaken about the year and that in reality he was summoned in the summer of 1942 and not 1941. In truth, as we have just seen, the concrete decision to exterminate all the Jews of Europe was taken only during the autumn of 1941. Haas wrote, "It was in the summer of 1941 when I was suddenly summoned to Berlin by the Reichsfuhrer SS through one of his adjutants. Contrary to his habit, he received me alone and declared the following: The Führer has ordered the final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, are tasked with carrying out this order. The existing extermination centers in the Eastern Zone do not have the capacity to carry out the large-scale actions planned. Therefore, for this purpose I have chosen Auschwitz, first because of its favorable location from the point of view of communications, and second because the site intended for such an action can easily be isolated and camouflaged in this region. A difficult and painful task awaits you, to which you must devote yourself completely and disregard the difficulties that await you. The details will be communicated to you by Sturmbannführer Eichmann, who will meet you shortly. The relevant administrations will be informed by me in due course. You must maintain absolute silence about this order, even towards your hierarchical superiors. After your conversation with Eichmann, you will send me without delay the plans for the proposed installation. The Jews are the eternal enemies of the German people and must be exterminated. All the Jews we can lay our hands on must be annihilated without exception, now, during the war. If we fail today to destroy the biological foundations of Jewry, it will be the Jews who later annihilate the German people." Eichmann went to Auschwitz in August. With Haas, he discussed the plan they were going to implement, beginning with the extermination process. Eichmann explained that the only possible method was gas. The inclusion of women and children in the liquidation plan made the shooting method too costly for the SS who had to carry it out. After studying the different types of gas already used in the vans and in the extermination of the handicapped, they agreed to use a more practical gas, Zyklon B. Who were the prisoners of Auschwitz? Here live the dead, read an inscription carved on one prisoner barrack. In reality, In the universe of the concentration camps created by the Nazis, the prisoners formed an army of slaves in striped uniforms whose function was to work toward their own destruction. In the diabolical cauldron of Auschwitz, the deportees were manipulated and conditioned by the Nazis who forced them to collaborate in the execution of their own deaths. For the prisoners, the impact upon arrival at the camp was terrible. The sinister appearance of the barbed wire fences, the diabolical vision of the flames coming out of the crematoria, the nauseating smell of burning flesh and hair. All this accompanied by the brutality with which they were received, the violent and immediate separation from their loved ones, ignorance of what awaited them, turned the arrival of prisoners into an unspeakable nightmare. All the survivors recall in their memories this terrible initial shock. Faced with the deafening noise of the SS shouts, the threatening barking of dogs, the blows, and the blinding light of the searchlights, they remained stunned, dazed, unable to react. Arrival at the camp represented a radical rupture, the crossing of a frontier, entry into a totally unknown, unexpected, and unpredictable universe. After the initial selection, children, the elderly, the sick, or those judged unfit for work were directed to the left-hand column and immediately murdered in the gas chambers. The others were placed in the right-hand column, and their end was merely delayed by a few months. It is said that of 500 men, women, and children arriving in one transport to Auschwitz, only 96 men and 29 women were selected for work. The number of those selected for the right-hand column depended less on their physical condition than on the camp's current needs or the space available. These were marched to the main camp, Auschwitz I, or to Monowitz, Auschwitz III, where they were forced to undress in front of one another. Then came disinfection, the shaving of the entire body from head to toe, including the most intimate parts, the shower, and the distribution of clothes. Next, the prisoner was registered on a form containing his personal data, which was then sent to the camp's political department and copied in 15 copies for the various services. Finally, a number was assigned to him, replacing his name for the entire duration of his detention, with the exception of the German common law prisoners transferred from other camps to serve as capos. The first detainees were Polish men, who constituted, until early 1942, the largest contingent of Auschwitz prisoners. Between 140,000 and 150,000 people, including a few women, of whom around 74,000 would lose their lives. Most were political prisoners arrested for belonging to the nationalist or communist resistance, or civilians rounded up. Normally, they wore sewn on their chest a red triangle, with the initial P indicating their nationality. There were also Jews in this situation, arrested individually for the same reasons. In general, they knew they would remain in the camp until the end of the war. And although they were convinced of Germany's eventual defeat, they lived in fear of not surviving until then. Indeed, the progressive deterioration of conditions in the camp, epidemics, the growing shortage of food, overcrowding, all these factors reduced the chances of survival. The risk of being denounced or discovered as a member of a resistance movement was also a real threat, to the point that the different political groups fought each other fiercely. Despite everything, among the Poles, national solidarity was stronger than political differences, which allowed them to occupy certain privileged positions in the camp. As the war progressed, the number of political prisoners of other nationalities increased, especially Czechs, Slovaks, French, Dutch, and Belgians. In the center of the red triangle that identified them, the initial of the country indicated their nationality, except for Germans. The reputation of the different area national groups among the political prisoners varied. The Czechs were well regarded, the Russians considered suspicious and savage, and the Yugoslavs, especially the women, enjoyed great esteem for their people's courageous fight against Nazism. In the clandestine organization of the women's camp, it was the French women who took the lead. Despite the error inherent in any generalization, it was common for national solidarity to prevail over ideology or religion, even among Jews. However, the red triangle was not always synonymous with solidarity or ethical behavior. The second group consisted of Russian prisoners of war. They arrived at Auschwitz in mid-1941 to build the Birkenau camp. Their condition was already pitiful because of their previous stay in the Lambsdorff camp, from which they had come on foot during a march of several weeks with almost no food. Until 1942, they were confined in blocks of Auschwitz, forming a separate camp, the Russian prisoners of war labor camp. Almost all died from exhausting work, hunger, mistreatment, or were gassed. Haas himself admits that the physical condition of the Russians was so deplorable that they no longer showed any reaction. They wandered aimlessly, expressionless on their faces. They hid in a corner to chew anything edible they found by chance, or to die in silence. The third group, wearing the green triangle, consisted of professional criminals, former prisoners, and people with police records. They frequently exercised supervisory functions over the other prisoners. The choice of murderers, thieves, traffickers, and sadists for this type of service was not alien to the worldview that reigned in the Nazi concentration camp universe. The eradication of all established moral precepts. For the Nazis, beating a detainee to death was not a crime. One simply recorded that the number in question had died. The cause of death was entirely secondary. Himmler constantly insisted on the idea that pity was a betrayal of SS ideals. Another group consisted of the asocials, identified by the black triangle. Women engaged in prostitution, especially Germans, lesbians, and vagrants. In the women's camp, it was not the Greens, that is, the criminals, who dominated, but the asocials, particularly the prostitutes. Almost all German, they usually held the position of block leader. There were also a few Polish women. Unlike the Dachau and Sachsenhausen camps, where homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses were numerous, at Auschwitz these groups were relatively small. Male homosexuality was severely punished by the Nazi regime, and homosexuals were regarded as enemies of the state, which explains their greater presence in the re-education camps created after 1933. From the beginning, homosexual detainees wore their own badge, a pink triangle. Female homosexuality did not carry the same importance. Lesbians were included in the asocial group and wore the same black triangle. From a Nazi point of view, a woman was merely a reproducer in the service of multiplying the race, and her personal choices were totally insignificant. It is estimated that in Germany around 50,000 homosexuals were arrested, and of these between 10,000 and 15,000 lost their lives in the camps. And the last group of prisoners to pass through Auschwitz consisted predominantly of Jews. From 1942 onward, Jews formed the main group at Auschwitz-Birkenau and the only one destined for total liquidation. They were identified by two yellow triangles forming the Star of David with the initial of their country of origin. The selection of those to be murdered immediately was carried out by SS doctors on the arrival ramp at Birkenau. The Juden ramp, which began on July 4th, 1942 with a Slovak convoy, and ended in November 1944 with the cessation of the gassing of 500,000 Hungarians on the band ramp built expressly for that purpose. In general, the SS considered that Jews ceased to live the moment they stepped down from the wagons upon arrival at the camp. All the humiliations, all the violence of the SS and the capos were thus justified. As already mentioned, approximately 1,100,000 Jews, including hundreds of thousands of children, perished at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But what makes the murder of the Jews unique is not the number of victims, but the intention of the perpetrators. Only in the case of the Jews did the Nazis plan the physical elimination of every man, every woman, every child. All the other groups mentioned earlier were victims of Nazi terror, but only the Jews were destined to disappear from the face of the earth. Once again, it is the Auschwitz commandant himself who confirms this in his memoirs. The hierarchy of triangles reflects the ideological priorities of the SS, which often ended up being assimilated by the detainees themselves. This identification, often unconscious, made the color of the triangle a highly effective tool of social classification. The result was a stratification of prisoners from top to bottom that guaranteed the proper functioning of the principle of divide and rule, essential in the space of Nazi concentration camps. The status attributed to the wearers of the triangles sometimes varied according to the camp and the period. Nevertheless, those generally at the top were the bearers of red and green triangles, that is, political prisoners and criminals. The lowest category in the hierarchy was always occupied by the bearers of yellow triangles, the Jews. Just above them were the bearers of black triangles, the asocials, followed by the bearers of purple triangles, the Jehovah's Witnesses, potentially in a better position. While the common law prisoners were there for their crimes, the German political prisoners for their opposition to the regime, and prisoners of other nationalities for opposition more or less proven to the German occupation, race was the sole criterion for internment for Jews from all countries under Nazi domination, including the Roma. The most infamous medical experiments of Auschwitz. The practice of medicine in Hitler's Germany constitutes one of the darkest aspects of the history of the Holocaust. The Nazis assigned doctors a central role in the extermination program. They not only actively participated in the so-called mercy death, that is, the T4 program, by murdering people whom Nazism considered unworthy of living, but it was also they who, upon the arrival of victims in the concentration or extermination camps, selected who would die immediately and who would still contribute a little to the German war effort. It was also doctors who, despite their oath to save human lives, carried out the most abominable pseudo-scientific experiments on children, women, and men whose right to life and physical integrity was purely and simply denied. The adult euthanasia program also began in 1939. All people suffering from disabling illnesses were killed in gas chambers and incinerated with the complicity of the medical corps. Death certificates gave false diagnoses according to the age and previous symptoms of the victims. Finally, patients with minor malformations, moderately senile people, war cripples, difficult children, and other similar cases were also selected by doctors to be subjected to euthanasia. This Nazi program was responsible for the death of at least 70,000 people in Germany until 1941, after which it turned to the extermination of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, and Germans opposed to the Nazi regime. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 70 medical research projects were carried out in the Nazi camps, conducted by German universities and research institutes, including many types of experiments on prisoners. Himmler showed great interest in this type of activity from the outset. In 1943, wishing to protect experimentation, he ordered that all experiments be submitted for his prior approval. Himmler did not merely facilitate them. He followed their progress closely, studied the results, and even suggested improvements. But above all, he protected the doctors, assuming responsibility for their actions, and did not hesitate to brand any possible critics as traitors. Around 200 doctors were sent to the concentration camps. Their work consisted of directing selections and participating in medical trials. Injection of phenol directly into the heart or intravenously to prolong agony. Inoculation with typhus virus. Injection into the eyes to change their color. Sterilization. Castration. Subcutaneous injection causing painful tumors. Experiments on tissue changes due to malnutrition were some of the pseudo-scientific tortures inflicted on men, women, and children in total and absolute violation of the medical code of ethics. Many experiments aimed to justify and apply racist theories through biology and to promote the supremacy and multiplication of the Aryan race. Thus, for example, 40 Roma were subjected to experiments to prove that they had different blood. 150 murdered Jewish men and women at Auschwitz served doctors in observing the particularities of their skulls. In the context of racial struggle were also the experiments carried out on dwarfs and twins. Other trials aimed to develop survival mechanisms in extreme conditions of altitude, freezing temperature, or absorption of seawater. Vaccines and medicines were also tested to combat contagious diseases, wounds, or inhalation of chemical gas. A series of experiments sought to discover the fastest and most efficient method of annihilating human life, from complete sterilization of women to injections of chloroform into victims' hearts and the use of Zyklon B gas. All these experiments, which involved unbearable suffering, were performed on human beings and, obviously, against their will. Among all the SS doctors who worked at Auschwitz, one name left an indelible memory among the survivors. Joseph Mengele, chief medical officer of the camp, better known as the Butcher of Auschwitz or the Angel of Death. From 1943 until the evacuation of the camp in January 1945, he was responsible for the death of approximately 400,000 people. It was he whom the deportees encountered when they stepped down from the wagons, directing the initial selection with a whip in his hand. They met him again during partial selections when he designated victims with a casual flick of his index finger while whistling in air from Tosca. But in reality, Mengele, doctor of medicine and philosophy, did not content himself with selecting. According to the doctor Miklos Niisli, who arrived at Auschwitz in May 1944, deported from Hungary, with a group of prisoners consisting of 26 doctors, 6 pharmacists, and their respective families, upon the arrival of convoys, several guards walked the rows of prisoners looking for twins and dwarfs. Some mothers, believing they would be treated better, handed them over without hesitation. They did not know that they would soon die at Mengele's hands. That is why, from his arrival, Mengele separated dwarfs and twins on the ramp. For the same purpose, he placed them in the right-hand column and had them taken to the barrack of those who were not yet to die, where they enjoyed good food and hygienic conditions so that there could be no possibility of contagion between them, and, consequently, that they could not die separately. They had to die together and in good health. Convinced that he had been chosen to discover the cause of multiple births, Mengele spent hours at the microscope and on the dissection table, gown and hands blood-stained, examining and comparing obsessively. The screams of the victims, the black smoke from the crematoria, the smell of burning flesh did not disturb him. After each selection, Mengele returned to this human hell in which he felt at home. Among evildoers and criminals, the most dangerous type is the criminal doctor, wrote Niisli. The life and death of hundreds of thousands of people were in his hands, and he did not hesitate to use his power according to his criminal vision of humanity. The testimony of Miklos Niisli, written in 1946, is exceptional. Appointed by Mengele as chief doctor of the crematoria, Niisli was, as he himself recounts, an eyewitness and involuntary participant in the work in the Auschwitz crematoria, in whose flames more than 1 million human beings disappeared. Although he was a prisoner, Niisli was far from the condition of the other detainees. Not only because his personal situation in terms of food, clothing, and comfort in the camp was totally different, but above all because of the function he held, dissecting the dead and identifying pathologies. Moreover, as chief doctor of the crematoria, he depended exclusively on Mengele's direct orders, so that he came to live and work at the very heart of the Nazi extermination machine. In addition to his work in anatomy and the laboratory, Niisli was also responsible for medical assistance to all the SS personnel of the crematoria, about 120 men, and the 860 prisoners of the Sonderkommando. He could move around the 4 crematoria from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. One day, Niisli received the medical file of 2 young twins in a coffin. In his accounts, he writes, "I lifted the lid. Inside were 2 twins, aged about 2 years. I ordered 2 of my men to place the bodies on the dissection table inside the crematorium. I opened the files and examined them. Thorough clinical analysis, accompanied by X-rays, descriptions, and drawings indicating the different characteristics of these 2 little beings from a scientific point of view. All that was missing was the pathological report, and my job was to produce it. The twins had died at the same time, and at that moment they lay side by side on the dissection table. It was they, or their little bodies, that were to solve the secret of race reproduction, to take a step forward in discovering the secret of multiplication of the race of superior beings destined to rule. That was the purpose. In the future, every German mother would have to bear in her womb the maximum number of twins. The project, conceived by the theorists of the Third Reich, was absolute madness, and its experiments were entrusted to Dr. Mengele, chief medical officer of KZ Auschwitz, the famous criminal doctor. The immediate objective was the production of pure Germans to replace the Czechs, Hungarians, and Poles, all condemned to destruction. The next day, While dissecting the corpses of 4 fathers of gypsy twin children under 10 years of age, Niesley made a discovery that horrified him. The 4 children had died from an injection of chloroform into the heart, causing immediate death by cardiac arrest. The SS guards with their dogs invaded the barracks and forced everyone out, making them line up. The following morning, they were already reduced to ashes. These remained piled up in the crematorium courtyard awaiting collection. However, on Mengel's express order, the bodies of the 12 fathers of twins were not delivered to the flames. Before sending them to the gas chamber, Mengel had marked them with a special chalk. In this group were twins of various ages, from newborns to 16-year-old adolescents. At that moment, wrote Niesley, they lay on the morgue floor, brown-skinned children with black hair. The work of classifying them by pair was exhausting. I had to ensure they were not mixed up, because if anything compromised the study of these rare specimens, it would be I who paid with my life. After dissection, Niesley handed the corpses to the Sonderkommando members to burn them, and kept the organs of scientific interest for Mengel's analysis and selection. These were then sent to the Anthropological Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. In addition to deaths by gas and by chloroform injection into the heart, Niesley observed death by shooting. One night, while still in the dissection room, he heard gunfire in the next room, accompanied by heartrending screams. He counted 70 shots, and once silence returned, he went to see what had happened. Niesley recalls, it was a daunting scene. Before me lay the naked bodies of 70 women. Twisted, bathed in their own blood and that of others, they intertwined, forming a diabolical pile. As my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness of the room, I discovered with horror that not all were dead. Some were still breathing, slowly moving arms and legs. With glassy eyes, they tried to raise their bloodied heads. I lifted the heads of a few, 2 or 3 still alive, and understood that in addition to death by gas and by chloroform injection, there also existed a third method of execution, a bullet in the nape of the neck. Birkenau, Auschwitz II, is the final solution, from the wall of death to the gas chambers by the Sonderkommando. As explained, the first experiment in murder in a gas chamber was carried out at Auschwitz. The initiative to use Zyklon B gas belongs to SS man Karl Fritsch, who, in the absence of the camp commandant Rudolf Haas, took the decision. Later, he himself boasted of having been the inventor of the gassing of prisoners. However, the liquidation process was planned from the outset, and the gassing of detainees took place in the camp prison located in Block 11, whose windows were walled up. It was intended primarily for men and women suspected of resistance acts, preparation or complicity in escape, or contact with the outside world. Zyklon B gas was manufactured by the company Deadliest, founded in 1917. It was a powerful pesticide containing 95% hydrocyanic acid. The percentage later rose to almost 100%, increasing the product's lethal capacity. A Deadliest document states that between 1942 and 1943, the company delivered 27,434.5 kilograms of Zyklon B to all the camps, of which 19,652.69 kilograms went to Auschwitz alone. According to the statements of Haas and members of the Sonderkommando, a much smaller quantity of gas sufficed to kill 1 million people at Auschwitz. On the first and second floors of Block 11, more than 100 prisoners were crammed into large cells. In the basement, in small windowless dungeons, so low that it was impossible to stand upright, the most dangerous detainees were locked up. Philip Muller, a prisoner for 3 years at Auschwitz, testifies, "The SS led us to Block 11, whose entrance door was closed, unlike the other blocks. SS Oberscharfer Plag opened it and ordered us to enter. We went down a labyrinth of corridors leading to the cells and underground dungeons of the block. Silence was broken only by the clinking of his keys. Our jailer opened the bar door, whose lock screeched, and we entered the central corridor. A suffocating smell overwhelmed us. The blackened, oily floor of the corridor leading to the cells had walls whitewashed with lime, and the light was dim. The cell into which Maurice and I were pushed had neither window nor ventilation system. It measured about 3 meters by 3. When the guard closed the iron door, darkness was total. Every Saturday morning the cells were cleaned. After a brief meeting to examine the detainees' reports, the commission, composed of a doctor and the block leaders, went down to the basement led by the camp commandant. The aim was to remove the prisoners sentenced to death. They were taken to the washrooms and forced to undress. As already mentioned, the indelible tattooing of numbers on prisoners upon arrival at the camp was practiced only from March 1942. After registration of those condemned to death, they were led in front of a brick wall separating Block 11 from Block 10, against which a kind of black cloth was stretched. Then the detainees were executed with a bullet in the nape of the neck facing the wall. Once dead, the corpses were collected by other prisoners who carried them on stretchers and deposited them in a corner before being transported to the crematorium. In a cell of Block 11, the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe was imprisoned. Born in 1894, he was taken prisoner in February 1941 and interned in Pajak prison in Warsaw. 3 months later, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he received the number 16670. After the escape of a prisoner from his block, the SS decided in reprisal to kill at random 1 detainee out of 10 in the block. Among them was a Polish worker named Franciszek Gajowniczek. Married and father of a child, the man lamented bitterly, "What will become of my wife and my son?" Kolbe heard Franciszek's weeping and decided to save his life by offering to take his place, which the SS accepted. Kolbe was murdered 2 weeks later by a phenol injection. Between 1943 and 1945, a group of Jewish prisoners, a few Poles, and a few Soviet prisoners of war lived longer than any other detainees at the very heart of the catastrophe. They were part of the Sonderkommando tasked with the most abominable job, operating the extermination apparatus of Birkenau in the context of carrying out the final solution of the Jewish question. Almost all of this commando, periodically renewed, ended up being murdered by the camp SS. Their average lifespan was about 4 months. At the end of this period, an SS company would round up the commando and machine gun all its members. Half an hour later, a new group designated as the Sonderkommando would arrive. They were forced to remove the clothes of their dead comrades, of whom soon only ashes remained. The first task of each Sonderkommando was to burn its predecessor. Niesley recounts that during his medical visits, there was always someone unable to bear his duties who begged him for a quick and painless poison. The commando's main role was to help the SS get people into the changing rooms, help them undress, and enter the gas chambers. Sometimes it was they themselves who had to lift the lids of the openings through which the SS poured the Zyklon B. Until now, wrote Shlomo Venezia, I had never said it,